Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Bob Fisher. I'm the Assistant to the Bishop for Communications, Mission Interpretation. Our guest today is Michael Moore, who is the copyright guru at 1517 Media, Augsburg Fortress. With that, Michael, I'll turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I don't know quite how many of these I've done so far this year, but we're approaching a dozen. Various synods have asked for this presentation because they're concerned, as they should be, about whether or not their churches are in compliance. So let's start off with a couple of things that if you don't write anything else down during this presentation, this is the stuff I want you to write down. I'm Michael Moore. I'm the Rights Management Specialist for 1517 Media, which includes all of the imprints of 1517 Media, which is Fortress Press, Augsburg Fortress, Beaming Books, Broadleaf Books, and Spark House. Here's the important 2 bits of information. I can be reached very easily the following 2 ways. Via email, and that email address is copyright, COPYRIGHT, at 1517.media, 1517.media. So that's the email extension, which is not one of the usual ones, so don't worry, it will get to me if you use that email address. The second is by direct telephone contact, and that number is 612-330-3530, and you can reach me anytime Eastern time from 8 o'clock to 3:30. Those are my 9 o'clock, excuse me, to 3:30. Those are my phone contact hours. I am often at my desk at other times during the day, but I will answer the phone when it rings during that time if I'm not on the phone with somebody else. If I am on the phone with somebody else, obviously, please leave me a message. I'll call you back. Be sure to include your telephone number. And if you email me, include your telephone number, because I've found over time, and this is my 14th year as a copyright specialist, that conversation is often the easiest way to deal with copyright related issues, which are complicated and arcane. So we're going to lay a little bit of groundwork here to start, which is what exactly is a copyright? A copyright is a thing that is used to protect what's called an original work of authorship, which means that thing that you wrote. If you're the pastor, that sermon that you wrote, although we'll talk a little bit later about who actually holds the copyright to that, but it is covered by a copyright, your sermon, and we'll discuss who actually owns those rights a little bit later. It could be a work of art, could be a musical composition, a poem, just about anything. The banners, the paraments, the vestments, all of those things can be placed under copyright so that they're protected. And it is the expression of the idea that's protected, not the idea itself. There's a zillion ways to articulate ideas. I don't know how many different math curriculums there are out there that talk about how you add 2 numbers together and get a result. And when that happens, the expression, the how you do that, the procedure you do is what's under copyright, not the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, which is not an idea, it's something more factual. So an idea itself cannot be placed under copyright. The protections granted by a copyright are so that the owner of that original work of authorship has one fundamental right almost all of the time, and that is the right to say, I don't want you to be able to reproduce my work. And that's the fundamental right to say, no. Nope, not going to let you do it. Don't want you to play with my stuff. If an original work of authorship is to be used by someone other than the rights holder, permission to use that has to be obtained ahead of time. After the fact is a really dangerous way to do this, because if you do it after the fact, you're going to wind up getting charged a whole lot more because somebody said you should have asked me first. Just making copies without permission is an infringement of someone's copyright. So making a photocopy of that favorite meme of yours to put it on your cubicle wall, technically not legal. Now, is anybody going to cause you any problems doing that? Like as not, no. And you can guide yourself by asking this question: is it logical to assume money would have changed hands if I did this? And for making a single copy of something, probably not. But if somebody comes after you, you might wind up paying the lawyers. Works no longer under copyright are said to be in the public domain. And I missed a point that I want to loop back to real quickly, which is it doesn't matter whether or not you ever use the copies of things that you make. Just pushing the button on the copier and making those copies is what is the infringement. Okay, so the law is pretty strict about that because it really doesn't want to fool around with having to deal with gray areas very much, although there are plenty of gray areas that we have to deal with. So works that are no longer under copyright are said to be in the public domain. In the United States, it's become a bit of a moving target. Until the end of December of this year, anything published from 1926 to the present is potentially under copyright. On January 1, that will switch to all of the stuff that was published in 1925 lapsing into the public domain. So on January 1, 1926 to the present. How long does a copyright last? A while. So there is a provision for copyrights in the Constitution. It's in one of the articles of the Constitution. I can't remember which one. And originally copyrights were only for books and only for 7 years. Over time, this has changed. So the term of copyright in the United States of America is what I like to refer to as absurd. It's absurdly long, as a matter of fact. Anything before 1925 is in the public domain. From 1925 to 1978, the term of copyright in the United States is 95 years from the date of publication. 95 years from the date of publication. All of this information, by the way, will be provided to you in a document that Bob's going to send out. So don't make furious notes. It's not worth the effort. I have this all in an outline. It's all going to be sent to you if you signed up via email for this seminar. So from 1925 to 1978, 95 years, with some rules. They had to be registered with the Register of Copyrights at the Library of Congress. They had to be published with the copyright notice on them, including the year of publication, and it was duly renewed at the time the copyright expired. If all of those things accrue, the work stays in the public domain. If any one of those things was missed at the end of its original term of copyright, that thing has lapsed into the public domain. But in 1979, things changed. And the reason they changed was the United States signed a convention, an international convention on copyright. We had been a nation that did things by statute in terms of copyrights, statutory copyright, which is why it had to be registered with the Register of Copyrights. And by signing what's known as the Berne Convention on Copyrights, we changed from statutory copyrights to moral rights. And that meant that you no longer had to register your copyright. You can assume that when you finish your sermon this Sunday, whoever owns the copyright owns it already without it being registered. And the copyright lasts for the full term of its copyright, which does not need to be renewed. And copyright happens as soon as the work is complete. So what that means for you is you already own it, and a notice of copyright is no longer required if you want to protect it. But if you think somebody has infringed your copyrights on your sermon, whoever owns the rights to that sermon cannot sue over that infringement until that registration of the copyright has occurred. So how long? From 1978 to the present, it is the life of the longest surviving author plus 70 years. So the soonest anything could go into copyright that was created today and the owner of that copyright went face first into dinner tonight would be the end of 2090. It's a long time. Copyrights always expire at the end of the calendar year. And that does seem like a long time. And as I said before, it's absurd. Why is it so long? Blame Walt Disney. Blame Walt Disney, because a famous mouse was about to lapse into the public domain, and the Disney people panicked a little bit and said, we can't have that happen. So you can also blame not only the Disney Corporation, but the Sonny Bono Copyright Extension Act of 1998. Yes, that Sonny Bono, I've Got You Babe, married to Cher at one point, died crashing himself into a tree on a California ski slope. And so the House and Senate, in their infinite wisdom, decided to name a Copyright Act after him. It's a fitting memorial, actually. Guy created a lot of intellectual property. What that did was add 25 years to the term of copyright. Whether or not that will ever be extended again, I don't know. Patents all expire after 95 years, so making copyrights last longer than patents seems absurd, but there's an awful lot of stuff in the world of copyright that is more than a little bit absurd. So now we've laid the basis for what copyrights are and how they kind of work. Now we need to switch a little bit to say, how does that affect the church? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the thing that churches all have under the law that grants them the right to use stuff that's under copyright without ever having to worry about it. Churches have a broad performance license, a live performance license for the performance of literary, dramatic, and musical works in the context of live, in-person worship. And what that means is, as soon as the echo dies away when that hymn has been sung, the performance license ends. It'll start up again if you sing that hymn again. Sometimes that happens in a service. Or it'll start for a new piece of music when it starts to be played, or for a poem that you want to read in the context of worship for some reason, either as part of the sermon or as some other thing. All of those things are great. You can do them in live in-person worship. So that means there's some restrictions to that. Obviously, live is one of them. So you think, well, we're live streaming, that's fine. Not so much. The next restriction is in person, on site, site-specific worship. So that means in your sanctuary or on Easter morning down the block at the park, so as to be able to welcome the sunrise and the resurrection at the same time. Where the people are gathered is where your church is and where the site specificity of the license is covered. Okay? This assumes a few things. That you're not using third-party recordings for which you'd have to clear performance rights. That you don't charge admission. A free will offering is fine. And that you are staying within those boundaries. Why I mention admission is that St. Olaf College, one of the ELCA affiliated colleges, switched from having a Christmas festival that was considered to be a worship service and the contribution that you made to attend it when you got a ticket was voluntary to, we're going to charge you $30 a piece. And the whole thing about charging you $30 a piece set off some alarm bells. They were going to simulcast the thing in movie theaters and all that, and they sent me a request. And I sent back an email that says, you know, your one license isn't going to work anymore because this is not site specific and you're charging admission. And fortunately, they still had about 2 weeks to clear all the permissions for the simulcast before the performances happened. And we managed to get it done, and I have become their best friend ever since. So that's kind of nice. But just know that you can't charge tickets. You can get a free will offering, but you can't actually charge for letting people attend. One other thing to note, video is specifically exempt from the live church performance license. partly because this law dates from 1978. And there wasn't any such thing as a video cassette recorder. So there wasn't any way to play video in your worship service. So the law doesn't actually deal with it. Problem there is, of course, the law not actually dealing with it means it's outside the scope of the law. So showing video is one of those things that you have to be really careful about. I have a dear friend who was once a colleague of mine at Augsburg Fortress in our sales and service department, who when she was an intern here at Luther Seminary, getting ready to go on her first call, which she's gleefully enjoying down in the state of Nebraska, had her church here in the Twin Cities showed a video. They even got permission to show the video. And that was great because they had gotten that figured out. But what they did was also stream the service. And then they recorded it and put it out as a podcast. And the person who actually gave them permission to use the video found the podcast and said, hey, wait a minute. I said live worship. You didn't ask me permission to post it online. And they wound up writing him an $800 check for online use of his video. And she asked me about that, and I said, 4 words, you got off cheap. Okay, the fines for this kind of stuff are really expensive. We'll talk about those later, but $800 after the fact was a kind of reasonable rate. So you do need to take care of these things. You need to be a little bit careful, because while you think you have certain rights, and you really do, they're not as extensive as you might think they are. And so once we start doing some other things like creating bulletins or online worship services, we need to start minding our P's and Q's about what it is we need to license. So let's start with the easy stuff. Let's talk about print. Print is a little bit more limited in scope than your online worship service. So print is a little easier to deal with. We'll lay some groundwork here again for what it means and what it is you're exactly doing. And so when we expand into online worship and video and all of that other stuff, we're going to have a little bit better handle on what the concepts are about. So when a church bulletin is printed, the church becomes a de facto publisher of a brand new edition of everything that is in the bulletin. And if any of that content is under copyright, like a hymn tune, a hymn text, a poem, whatever, permission to publish that new edition of that material must be obtained ahead of time. Okay? I can't emphasize ahead of time enough. As my friend's example for $800 for the use of a video illustrates, after the fact, the rates go up. If somebody finds out that you used their hymn online and normally would have charged you a $30 license, and you've already used it and already posted it, they decide to send you a $10,000 invoice. What are you going to do? You're going to contest it in some way or another, hope to negotiate it down, but one way or another, you're going to cut somebody a check. And so you want to be very, very careful about how that happens. So ahead of time is the most important aspect of this. If you are one of those churches that plans their worship at the last possible moment and then puts it online, you need to realize that the last possible moment for worship planning is probably 4 weeks ahead of this date of the service. I can't emphasize this enough. The line that drove me crazy, that fortunately, thank you God, is not nearly in as common a usage as it used to be, and which is a really miserable idea with regard to copyright related material, is I'd rather ask forgiveness than permission. I'm happy to grant you forgiveness, but the rates are going to go up. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to get overcharged or charged a bunch of extra if you have 17 hymns in your bulletin for a hymn sing and you happen to miss clearing one. Good faith effort will be rewarded. You can say to these people, I didn't realize it was under copyright. The 16 other things on here were all covered. forgive me, please, and what's your normal fee? We'd be happy to cut you the check. That's going to carry a lot of weight if you've done good faith effort. If you haven't done good faith effort, you've got problems. And that's when it starts to get expensive. So what is it that needs to be parsed when we do this? We, for music and in hymn purposes, we track 4 specific elements that you need to make sure get covered if and only if those things are included in your bulletin. They are the text. You can't have a hymn without words to sing. The chorus angelorum might be able to get away with it, but we humans, our praises are word related pretty much. And the tune, because you can't have a hymn without a tune to sing those words to. The arrangement, which is the lovely chords that the organist plays or the choir sings that go along with the tune. There's a zillion different ways to harmonize things. Any one of those different ways might carry a separate copyright from any of the others. So arrangements can be a little tricky, and we'll talk about even getting a little trickier here in a little bit if we have some time. And then the other thing is the translation of an original hymn into another language. Let's talk about that one real quick. As good Lutherans, and full disclosure, I'm not Lutheran, but I went to a Lutheran university. As good Lutherans, you will be familiar with some guy named Martin Luther, whom everybody in Lutheran world seems to think is really important. And Martin Luther wrote a hymn called Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, which in English translates to a mighty fortress is our God. He wrote the tune, he wrote the text. You want to sing Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott? Go right ahead. You want to sing a mighty fortress is our God? You better check on the translation of the German into English, because you will discover that those rights are held by Augsburg Fortress as they appear in almost every hymnal in the world. And in order to use it either in your bulletin in print or online in a videoed worship, you need to talk to me, or you need to have a license that covers that stuff. We'll talk about what that license is in a little bit. Each of the elements of a hymn might have a different rights holder, so you have to do a little bit of digging and due diligence. And again, we'll go over how to find some of that stuff out in a little bit, so that we're making sure that all is well. For your bulletin, you only need to worry about the things that are being printed. So if you're only printing the text, you have to concern yourself with the text of the copyright of the text. If you're printing the words and the tune, then you have to concern yourself with the words and the tune. If you are concerning yourself with the words, the tune, and the harmony, you got to clear all those rights. And then if you include the translation, you got to. So you only need to worry about what's being cleared for the publication of your bulletin. Okay. Don't worry about page numbers or titles. Those things cannot be placed under copyright. So when you publish, when you fix that bulletin in a new medium by putting it all on paper, you need to clear those things that are under copyright. So let's move on to the next thing that on or about the 16th of March, the whole world had to start doing. And the church got dragged kicking and screaming from the mid-19th century into the 21st century in about 72 hours. Now, I remember when my church tried to stream its first online worship service on the Sunday before Easter. We broke the internet. Everything on Facebook Live, because everybody in the Central Time Zone having a 10 a.m. service, it all went live all at the same time. And we broke the internet. Everything froze. So the next great idea was, we'll record it ahead of time and post it later. And that, to define things, is the difference between live stream and podcast. So live stream is, it's happening right now. If you are watching me at 11:28 a.m. Eastern Time on the 12th of November, this is a live stream. If you're accessing this later and watching it at any other time than 11:28 a.m. Eastern Time on the 12th of November 2020, this is a podcast. In terms of how licensing works, there is no difference. When you purchase a license to stream or podcast, it covers them both almost always. And again, you need to deal with the copyrights of all of those things. And unlike your bulletin, where it might only be the text, because that's all you used to print and create a new edition of the text, everything that's audible that's under copyright in a live stream or a podcast has to have its rights cleared ahead of time. So not only is there more detective work to do, it's going to cost you a little extra because there's more content that's being covered. So in terms of doing it in print, you're a publisher, a weekend publisher, because it's not really permanent. Bulletins tend to be quite ephemeral. In terms of putting it online, you become a broadcaster, and it's somewhat more permanent typically. And you also have to deal with all of those extra things that are heard that are under copyright and that are not necessarily in your bulletin. So there's a little bit more work to do. So how do you do this? What licenses do you use? Priscilla asked an interesting question. How you do the word copyright for the bulletin? You do the left parentheses, the letter C, and the right parentheses, and it typically will close up for you. Does in most Word fonts. That's an interesting question, and I'm glad you asked. It can be really helpful to know that. So when we purchase a license for what we need, I divide this into three distinct camps. One of which is the Augsburg Fortress set of liturgies. And I'm going to assume everybody's familiar with Evangelical Lutheran worship. So our liturgies license, a version of which is available for sale as a standalone in two forms, either our complete liturgical set or Evangelical Lutheran worship, or the license embedded in a subscription to sundaysandseasons.com, covers the set of liturgies that's covered by the specific license for print, projection, podcast, and live stream. So we allow you to do all of that stuff with any of those versions of the license. The ELW license, our full liturgies license, or your subscription to sundaysandseasons.com covers you for all of those things. But it only covers you for the material that is considered liturgical in nature. So in ELW, that's up to number 238, which is the Great Litany, and it says service music at the top of the page. Anything from there to the front of the book that is under copyright to or administered by Augsburg Fortress is covered by our liturgies license. It's true for all of the rest of our liturgies as well if you have the full liturgies license. There are some few things in that set of material that are not covered by our liturgies license. The overwhelming majority of those are covered by the license we're going to talk about next, which is one license. There are two third-party licenses that you're going to find useful. The one that Augsburg Fortress uses is one license. There used to be another license that's been enfolded into one license called License Sing Online. Those two entities merged in 2017 to form a brand new one license, which is a co-production of Oregon Catholic Press and GIA Publications. So GIA Publications are the people who bring you Marty Haugen. Oregon Catholic Press through License Sing were the people who used to license you for John Ylvasacher. So two of the contemporary big Lutheran worship folks are covered by one license, but they're not part of Augsburg Fortress. So one license can be useful if you're doing a lot of Ylvasacher or Marty Haugen. Augsburg Fortress, though, is a participating publisher in one license, as are about 150 others. So when you have one license in place, roughly 85% of the hymn content in ELW is covered by that license. So it's a good license to have, but it focuses exclusively or almost exclusively on acoustic style music and traditional style publishing. And so for Augsburg Fortress, Concordia, Oregon Catholic Press, GIA, it's essential. But if you are a different kind of worship habit, if you don't do traditional choir organ style worship at your church, if you have a praise band, if you are band led, if it is more contemporary style in worship, then the license that you're most likely to get is CCLI. They specialize, they want to corner the market in band led worship style. And so if you do that style, or if you have a blended service, you're going to probably want to look into getting CCLI for that content. Also, if you have a blended style, you might wind up doing them both. The vast majority of the resources in our hymnals are covered by one license, but there are some things that are covered by CCLI, and there are also some things that are not covered by a license at all. So, how do you know which license is best for you? Let's spend a few minutes dealing with that. I'm going to show you a couple of examples using sundaysandseasons.com, because that's how I do it all the time. And if you've ever had a copyright conversation with me, this is the program I'm looking at. So how do you look up a hymn in sundaysandseasons.com? Here I am on the home page. We click on the music tab. And then we see a whole lot of different ways to search for things. So the first one I'm going to search for, the first way I'm going to search is by the collection that you find it in and the hymn number. Once you have that information entered, you can hit enter or click on the search box if you find it anywhere. For Evangelical Lutheran Worship 401, which is one of my favorite copyright examples, you get Gracious Spirit Heed Our Pleading. To find out what licenses cover you, you click on the title, and here you see previews of how it is printed in Evangelical Lutheran Worship, or melody line and text only, if that's the way you want to use it for saving some space or for clarity, or however you want to do it. You can download these and use them in projection as well. So sometimes the melody line one is the best one for that. But in order to find out about the information we're looking for what license covers you for this, you click on copyright information. And you see that this one is listed twice. The reason for that is that Augsburg Fortress is the administrator of the rights. We are not the actual rights holder. The rights holder is Macamira University College, which, to the best of my knowledge, that post office box that you see there on the USA River is a boat stop that is 3 hours by kidney-busting Range Rover to the college itself. And so they ask us to administer rights for them. And in so doing, we send them a check twice a year, and American currency goes a long way to spreading the gospel at Macamira University College in Tanzania. So you'll see that Augsburg Fortress is listed as the person to contact. Macamira is listed as the actual rights holder, and the licenses that you can use to print this material are one license and the Augsburg Fortress Hymns and Songs license. A quick word about that license: don't buy it. It's not worth the paper it's printed on. For one thing, one license, while it costs more, covers 150 publishers instead of one. And for another, Augsburg Fortress's Hymns and Songs license does not cover podcast and streaming of our material. So please don't waste your money. So that's how you figure out that one license will cover you for the text. And you roll down and you see that the same thing accrues for the music. And so just to let you know, one of the reasons why I use this hymn is it was not always thus. The arrangement, the harmonization, is by a man named Egil Hovland, who, before he departed this mortal coil, used to ask that people contact him for the use of the arrangement in things. And so his contact information was here at sundaysandseasons.com. And one afternoon, about 5 o'clock, when I used to work a little bit later, a gentleman called me from St. Louis and said, I called the number in sundaysandseasons.com for this guy for his arrangement, and he hung up on me. What do I do? I've been fighting with my bulletin all day. It's driving me absolutely crazy. And this was my first time looking this one up, and I chuckled, and he said, "What?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if you looked at the address, but Mr. Hovland lives somewhere north of Oslo, and that's not Oslo, Wisconsin. And so here at 5 o'clock in the afternoon Central Time, it's probably 1 in the morning when you called him in Norway." And to his everlasting credit, this man who had been fighting his bulletin all day on a Friday afternoon was silent for a bit while the steam went out his ears and the pressure valve popped. And then it further went by him laughing for a good half a minute before he could control himself. And then he said, "I want to tell you something. The best part of this whole experience is the dude didn't even swear at me. He just hung up the phone." And so I use this one because it's interesting, it's international, it shows what I want you to see when it comes to what covers what. But now we're going to wander into a different minefield with a different way to search this stuff. So we're going to click on the music tab again. We're going to go into the title and keywords portion this time, because you can use any one of these fields to search for you. And as you can see, the one I've searched most often is "Morning Has Broken," and there's a reason for that. So this time you see a different set of results, and I want to explain this real quickly. You'll note there's a relevance bar down the left side of the page. When you search for a title or keywords, the database queries every instance of the word morning, has, and broken, and this is what you get: 83 results. The one it thinks is most likely is the one at the top with the widest relevance bar, and it turns out in this case that that is true. And so we click through again on "Morning Has Broken," and we look at the text and we go, uh-oh. Because the text is by a woman named Eleanor Farjeon, and Eleanor Farjeon has departed this mortal coil. And so her rights are held by the Miss E. Farjeon Will Trust and are used by permission of the David Higham Associates, which is a London, England law firm. And you can see right here that this shows that there's a rights holder, and this shows they don't have any third-party license coverage for anybody in North America. And so what it means for you to print, project, podcast, or stream this text, you need to contact directly the David Higham Associates of London, England at 11:40 a.m. Eastern Time. It is 4:40 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which means in London, they're getting ready to go have a pint if London were open. Now, I heard yesterday with another text by the same woman in the same situation that due to COVID-19, they have relaxed their payment restrictions. So if you contact them, there is every chance they will allow you to use this text at no charge. But they do charge for it under ordinary circumstances, which would be something you would pay for over and above your normal license agreement. So beware that when you're going and looking for hymns to make sure that you've got them licensed, you do a little bit of due diligence and you check to make sure that you have a license that covers, or you know who it is to contact. So if you see the word public domain, great. There won't ever be any licenses you need there. And you see that in this case, the harmonization is Augsburg Fortress. So how would you use this online for worship if you wanted to have it there and not worry about whether or not you had permission? Have the organist play it, because the tune's in the public domain. We own the arrangement. It's covered by your one license agreement, and tell people to open up the hymnal they have at home and sing away. And it will work just fine, because those are elements you have covered by your license. Otherwise, work a little ahead, get permission for use of the text. So that's kind of how you do it. I recommend maybe grabbing about 6 months worth of bulletins and checking against the hymns that you've used and see what licenses are best for you by creating a little tally mark spreadsheet. So that's basically how a lot of this stuff works for getting things licensed. If it's not under if it's under copyright and has a license holder, you need to be sure that you get that taken care of. One last thing to note, a subscription to sundaysandseasons.com does not actually provide you license to reproduce hymns that are under copyright. So one of the things that you need to know is that you have right of access to these files, but not right of reproduction. That's why I'm showing you how to research them ongoing as you do this. That's due to the large number of rights holders that are in the hymn section of any of our hymnals. We want you to be able to have a file you can use, then you can republish it as soon as you've gotten permission, and you can use it for streaming purposes once you have the licenses in place for that. So here's the other couple of things that we want to talk about here real quick. Curriculum rights. Augsburg Fortress is allowing the use of its curriculum online in closed meetings. The videos can be used in closed meetings. They can be put online for up to a week, unless you're a subscriber to SparkHouse Digital, in which case you can leave them a little bit longer. But the whole idea is you need to keep control of these things. You can share screens, you can do all sorts of stuff. The great urban myth of copyright is I own 300 copies of a book and I can make 300 copies of its contents. That, in the case of curriculum or hymns or anything, is what's going to get you into trouble because the law doesn't see it that way. The law says the holder of the original work of authorship is the one who gets to say no. And if they wanted you to have it as a single set of things, there is stuff that you have to deal with. Like permission. So one of the things that you want to know about, I saw a good question that I wanted to show you the answer to, so we'll go back to sharing my screen here for just a moment. How do you show that you have, oh, come on. Share screen, back to, where did Sundays and Seasons go? There it is. If you are looking for some of the copyright notices we need, they're not too hard to find if you have Sundays and Seasons. So you go through the day resources, you read in full, you download that content. It will show us a Word document that I need to share for a moment. This time we roll down to the bottom. And what I'm going to highlight is for our liturgies license. One License or CCLI at their websites will have a way for you to have their reporting language that you want. So what you'll do is put that either in a slide at the end of your presentation or in the comments if it's a podcast and you can put it in comments, or both if possible. And those things are required as part of the license. So it's easy to find. If you have questions about that, you can email me directly and that will also work quite well. Churches and disabilities is another issue that we need to talk about. Churches are exempt from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And while ostensibly the reason for that is the separation of church and state, take a look around your building. Is it possible for you to get a wheelchair into every possible corner? Are you in compliance with that kind of access requirement? Most churches are not. And most churches don't have the money to actually wind up getting their buildings, which are semi-public buildings, to be in compliance. So ostensibly for reasons of church and state, but also for the fact that we don't want to bankrupt a whole lot of churches and create the world's biggest building boom, churches are exempt from the Americans with Disabilities Act. Augsburg Fortress has a policy of trying to conform as closely to it as possible. So if you have a person with a visual infirmity, contact me. I'll be happy to help you if we can find a file for you to get something to be able to be read out loud. Or whatever needs to happen. The final couple of topics we're going to go to before we have a few minutes for questions is the one I referred to earlier on. Who holds the rights to the pastor's sermon? By long tradition, it used to be that pastors held sermon rights. But the problem is that somebody got irritated at their pastor, or their pastor got irritated with their church, and at some point, the thing went to court. And the court looked at it and said the very definition of a work for hire is a pastor's sermon. The pastor has to do that sermon every week as a condition of their employment, so the rights are held by the church, not by the pastor. I don't say this to actually have any pastors panic or have anybody say, oh no, what am I going to do? I am saying it so that you know what the understanding is in terms of the intellectual property rights. And also, when it comes time to renew your contract, or if you get that brilliant book idea, talk to your church council and say, hey, do you mind if? And the answer is probably going to be, if your relationship with them is even sort of healthy, it's going to be just fine. Please go ahead. And so I would say that that's one of those things you want to be sure is just well understood and not assumed, because assumptions will make everybody get into serious trouble. A couple of little bitty bits of things that are a little bit silly and related to copyright. The King James Version of the Bible, in England known as the Authorized Version, is by Act of Parliament perpetually under copyright in the United Kingdom. Other recent translations of the Bible, however, such as the New Revised Standard Version or the NIV or the Contemporary English Version, are under copyright. And so the problem there is, if they're under copyright, you need permission. If you look at the document that we downloaded from sundaysandseasons.com, right underneath the liturgies license copyright notice, there's one for the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible and one for the Revised Common Lectionary. If you use either of those things in your worship services, I encourage you to use them both. The minimum fine for infringing a copyright is $200 per incident. That assumes you've been a bad person and you need to be hollered at by the magistrate. That's $200 per incident. So if you did 100 bulletins that week, 100 copies of that same hymn is 100 different infringements. And so the cost for that single bulletin for that week, assuming it's only one hymn that you didn't license properly, is $20,000. A second hymn in the same bulletin is another $20,000. The fines escalate to a maximum of $10,000 per incident. So those 100 bulletins are $1 million a piece. I'll take the keys. Thank you very much. Please mind your P's and Q's when it comes to the copyright stuff. Okay, so that's pretty much what I have. I am now going to spend a minute looking through the chatted questions to make sure I didn't miss anything. And we'll take a look at those and we will answer what we can in the few minutes we have left. Sarah says, my church is planning to continue live streaming services after we resume in-person gatherings. So we need to purchase a license to live stream and publish service materials. In order to purchase the correct amount of licensing, how do you calculate the number of attendees of a service for virtual services? That's a really difficult question. It's one I don't have a really good answer to. I think there is some information at onelicense.net that has how they think you ought to do it. But I would say that you would not go too far wrong doing this if you took the number of average hits you got per week on a live stream and doubled it. So that's where you would go. Can you provide information on reporting handbell music played during a recorded service and streamed? Yes. So this is the next thing about these licenses. When you have a license with One License or CCLI, what really is important is not the actual piece of music so much as the rights holder for it. And so you would check the rights holder for the edition of the handbell music that you're using, and you would check against the rights holder list at one license and CCLI and see if that rights holder participates in the podcast and streaming version of CCLI or one license. And if so, you're going to be covered for this. Same is true for the prelude and the postlude or a choir anthem. The rights holder is the thing that determines whether or not something is covered by one license almost exclusively. Now, there are a few times where an old text is no longer granted permission for. Lift High the Cross comes to mind because the version of it that's in the Lutheran Book of Worship is a little bit too church militant, and they changed it for the one that's in ELW, and they no longer grant permission for the older one. So just be aware that sometimes these things do change a little bit. Our hymns whose text and music are owned by Augsburg Fortress, covered by Sundays and Seasons. We did go over that. It's one license that you need to report to for use of them online, especially. That's true for hymns and anthems and incidental instrumental music. For liturgical content, it's covered by sundaysandseasons.com. Gave us the keyboard shortcut, which is kind of nice. We dealt with the one about obtaining copyrights. Is there a way to search Sundays and Seasons for hymns that are in public domain or within your license without looking up specific hymns? And so back to the screen share we go, because the answer to that question is a resounding yes, indeed. So back here, back to the music tab, scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page. You can look for the copyright holder here. You can check a box that says one license or CCLI, or for print only, the Augsburg Fortress Hymns license. And you can search, going checkbox and search. And you will find for this that it takes a little while, but there are roughly 1,000 results that are covered by one license in our hymnals. So an excellent question with a nice simple answer for how to find it. Weekly small group Bible studies that use approved purchase sources are often enhanced by photos from Google or elsewhere. Is this allowed for a Zoom presentation? Probably. I think that there are some issues that maybe you and I can discuss offline. So send an email to copyright with your phone number, and I'll give you a call and we'll discuss it. Third-party permissions for photos are really, really chancy because often they are restricted to print use in a specific resource. So it sort of depends on where they sourced them and how you're using them. And so that's kind of a question. Do organ preludes and postludes live streams need permission to stream? If they are under copyright, the answer is yes. And that brings up one other quick thing about third-party performances. If you use somebody else's recording, you're going to be covered by your one license, your CCLI, that music, but not for the specific performance of it, which is under copyright to the person who performed it. So that's a little bit of a gray area. I would be a little concerned about using third-party recordings. So if you do have that and one license, you're covered for live and streaming. Okay, one license has two different licenses. So for Augsburg Fortress's purposes, the liturgies cover you for podcast streaming, projection, and podcast. One license has two different licenses. The first license is their print license, which is for including material in your bulletin. The second one is a podcast and streaming license. Those two things, when purchased separately, have the same price. So for an example, if you purchase the 25 to 100 rights for your bulletin, average weekly attendance for your bulletin, it costs $200 a year. If you publish standalone streaming rights, it's $200 a year. If you purchase them as a bundle, it's a total of $277 a year. So that is probably the way to go if you're doing both. All right. Okay, so Is handbell choir performance covered under one license? The mode of performance doesn't matter. It's who owns the rights to the particular thing you're performing. So if you're a handbell choir and the piece is under copyright to Augsburg Fortress, you can stream it under one license because we're the rights holder. Or GIA, they're the rights holders. You need to look at who did the publication or who it was licensed from. That really pretty much does it for my time today. I very much appreciate being invited to be with you. Do not hesitate to call me. I'm hoping that Bob will email the document that I based this seminar on, so you'll have my contact information right in front of you. But once again, it's copyright.1517.media, and also 612-330-3530.
Well, thank you, Michael. Glad to have you with us. There was one other question that scrolled by that I noticed here. Let's see. The question was, if a live stream and podcast are the same and covered with the same license, does that still apply to the podcast if used at any time in later years?
There are limits to these things. My understanding, although I haven't looked closely lately, is that one license covers you for a year. And after a year, you're covered for that particular podcast or live stream. We pretty much do what one license does in that situation. Chances are pretty good a year later, you're not going to actually wind up using that podcast again in all likelihood. You might pull a performance from it, in which case the new reintroduction of the pieces that you edit out of that would be a new podcast. So that's kind of how I would actually say it.
Okay. Right, clarification on that, can I ask?
Sure.
If you do your live streaming through a platform, whether it's YouTube or Mevo or whatever, does that mean that at the end of the year you have to go back through and delete all those?
You should.
Wow.
Chances are pretty good nobody's going to, and chances are also pretty good that nobody's going to worry about it, because chances are pretty good nobody's going to be going and looking at it again. But technically speaking, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. There's another question that popped up. Would we announce on a podcast that we have the copyright license, or how do we let people know that?
I would put it in a slide that goes into the video and in any comments that are available later for podcast. Otherwise, boy, does it sound clunky to talk about this is our one license number or this is our Augsburg Fortress license number. Show it on the camera, make a PowerPoint slide out of it, have it up there for 10 or 15 seconds and be done. And do it right at the end or right at the beginning. Don't do it in the middle. My philosophy, and other rights agencies might disagree with this a little bit, but my philosophy is this is worship. It's not copyright land. And so what I will do is say, put it at the end, make it unobtrusive, put it at the beginning and make it unobtrusive. Don't actually go out of your way to put it in the middle of the service, because then people stop paying attention to worship and they start paying attention to minutia that doesn't need to be paid attention to right at that moment. So I have been known to say, make it small enough that Grandmama needs both of her pairs of reading glasses in concert to actually read it. You're legally required to acknowledge these things, but it's as minimal as you can make it is the best way to do it.
Okay. And the fact that we would have a license agreement would be what we would need to answer any copyright claims that might arise.
Yeah. I would say yes. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer. I only occasionally play one on a seminar. But I would say that the thing that you need to be sure of is that you have your license information visible someplace on that podcast. And it has come up. There have been cases where I've gotten calls from churches where they have said, in the middle of using, in this case, it was a third-party recording, Facebook Live just cut us right off. And they didn't cut it back on again until in the middle of the sermon, and they didn't let us know it was coming. So they do watch these things, and they are starting to actually look closely. In part because there are rights holders out there who think money ought to change hands when this occurs.
Okay, thank you. One more popped up on the chat here, which is if a group records a cover piece, say of a praise hymn, to use in worship, what copyright is needed? And I would say this would probably apply to groups using different apps to record choirs singing together as well. What's needed there?
So in that case, we're going to differentiate here a little bit between third-party recordings where you went and found a cover of somebody else doing it, and this is a recording of your church choir that went through all of that stuff to get that done, however they did it. My church choir currently has small groups of us standing outside in St. Paul, Minnesota, and freezing slowly to death while we record things quickly. But what you would need in that case is rights to clear the performance of the music. So if it's your choir doing an Augsburg Fortress choir anthem, one license would cover you for that because you are the group that's doing it. You're part of the church, so it's not a third party that you've got to clear performance rights for. But if you were to take that same hymn or anthem and use a CD recording from the St. Olaf Choir, you'd not only have to clear the rights through one license for the hymn itself, you'd need to clear the rights with St. Olaf for the use of their choir's performance. So there's an additional layer of stuff that has to be dealt with.
So I know if some churches make recordings of songs like that and then they will distribute them or sell them. For worship itself, are we required to have a mechanical license too, or is that?
Good question, and the answer is no. For worship itself, for the podcast and streaming things that you're doing, that's what the licenses that we've been discussing are for. A mechanical license is specific to audio recordings that are fixed in a reproducible medium like electronic tape or a compact disc, or by extension, maybe a downloadable MP3 file might be a mechanical recording. And for those, you need to pay the statutory rate for phonorecords. If it's a piece that has been recorded before, there's no way that the rights holder can stop you from doing the recording. That's allowed, because if they told Group A over there that they can record it, there's no reasonable way to assume they would ever tell Group B, you cannot make that recording. So there's something called a compulsory license. You pay 9.1 cents per track to the rights holder. So you do 1,000 CDs, that's $91, and you're good to go. You inform them in writing, we're exercising our compulsory license, here's your check, and you're good. For video, it's called a synchronization license. I don't believe there is a statutory rate for that. There is a standard, but I'm not sure off the top of my head what it is.
Okay. But if we are making a recording, audio, video recording of a choir for worship, or a praise band for worship, that doesn't require those, correct?
Yes, because you would be using it under a one license or CCLI agreement of some kind.
Okay.
And it's not,
like a live performance.
Yeah. It would be a video performance. It would be a podcast or a live stream under those circumstances.
Okay. So a podcast within a podcast, but still.
Yeah. Yeah. It's you took it from over there because you didn't have time to do it live, and you edited it into the live stream or into the podcast. It becomes part of that podcast.
Well, great. I don't see anything else new popping up. So, Michael, I want to thank you for your time to be with us today. And I would ask, now we can all unmute and give Michael a round of applause.
Hey.